Here at ILSR, we recently received some shocking news as we learned of the sudden passing of our beloved co-founder, David Morris. A giant in the anti-monopoly field, an innovative thinker ahead of his time, and a crucial mentor to so many of us, David will be missed. I imagine I wasn't alone in diving into ILSR's archives to understand and revisit David's work and legacy in the wake of his death. Reading David's work from the last 50 years reminded me just how much he deeply understood about building local power, often well before political discourse arrived at the same conclusions. That's the inspiration for this week's episode of Building Local Power. Today, we're revisiting episode 22 of BLP, a 2017 interview between David Morris and ILSR Community Broadband Initiative Director Chris Mitchell. What struck me about this interview was how much of it could be said today, how much David anticipated our current moment. In the interview you're about to hear, when asked about the source of local power, David explained that the communal nature of cities has had massive power since medieval times. In doing so, David lauds the value of so-called sanctuary cities, asserting that the term really means mutual protection against a faraway federal government that doesn't necessarily act in the city's interest. Such thoughts are almost painfully relevant in the wake of June 14th's No Kings protests, as ever-present tensions about the alleged dangers of cities are even more inflamed by those in power. There are those who say cities should not be sanctuaries. One of the many pieces of wisdom we have from David Morris's long career runs counter to that. Cities have dramatic potential for their residents to protect each other and to act in each other's best interest. That's how local power is built. I hope you enjoy revisiting this 2017 interview as much as I did.
Local self-reliance, what does it mean? Where does it come from? Where are we going? I'm Chris Mitchell with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. I direct our broadband work. And David Morris, one of the co-founders of the organization, is back with us for, I believe, a third episode of Building Local Power.
Thanks, Chris, for having me on for a third episode.
Well, many more are on the way, I have no doubt. So let's explore this, and maybe we'll start at the beginning. A time in which there was a polarizing president, discussion of horrible corruption at the federal level, a president under attack, 1974, not the modern era. So you get together with a couple of friends and decide you're going to create the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. What did you have in mind in terms of what was the idea of what local self-reliance meant then?
Well, local self-reliance in 1974 and in 2017 means a focus on cities. And a focus on cities for a number of different reasons. One is that historically, cities are the basis of innovation. That goes back hundreds and even 1,000 years. The second is that in the United States, the population shifts are such that we went from being a rural nation before 1920 to being an urban nation to being an almost entirely urban nation. 80% of the people in the United States live in cities.
When you say cities, I think some people might think metro areas of more than 1 million people. But having worked with you, my sense is you actually just mean defined units. You're not talking about a specific scale. It's more the idea of people that live in close proximity to each other.
It's people who live in close proximity to each other and also that have a certain amount of authority to make decisions on their own behalf collectively. Yes, and it could be a city of 10,000 people. In fact, if you take a look at what used to be the Bureau of Statistics, when we used to have a Bureau of Statistics at the federal level, you take a look, you will find that there's a greater population in the United States in smaller cities than there are in larger cities.
So the third factor, what was that?
The third factor was that cities have become increasingly competent. They have created an internal capacity. That wasn't true in the 19th century. That wasn't true in the early 20th century. It was early 20th century when cities began to essentially run municipal electric utilities, run their streetcar companies,
water and sewer.
They also began to develop the municipal planning profession. They began to create data so they could compare each other on the basis of efficiencies, and that has continued. And so cities are now, very capable The fourth reason that we focus on cities is that that's where the rubber meets the road. No matter what happens at the federal level, you feel it at the local level, and they have to clean up the mess. They have to enact, what you have is Congress makes a law, and then the executive branch defines the regulations related to the law, and then the states have to, and then the localities have to interpret that and then put them down on the ground. And so, when it comes to an energy crisis, for example, the federal government can worry about the oil reserve, but it's the mayor that has to worry about your utility bills going up and people not being able to pay their utility bills. And the final reason for it, and a very important recent reason, is that technology is now decentralizing in its impact. In the 19th century and much of the 20th century, technology was centralizing when we shifted from renewable resources to fossil fuels to concentrated energy sources. We shifted from small to big. When we shifted from batch manufacturing to mass production, we shifted from small to big. When we shifted from wood to steel, we shifted from small to big. And so we created institutions and we created laws and we even created behaviors that assumed that bigger was better and bigger was more efficient. But at the end of the 20th century, and certainly in the 21st century, technology is moving us in the other direction. And that means that cities are not on the outside looking in to these huge structures, whether they be power plants or whether they be steel mills, but they're actually there where the economy, that is the real economy, the productive economy, is increasingly based.
One of the technologies that I would just highlight is the communications technology, which in many ways led to that centralizing, I think, in that you had like a telegraph, which was sort of one-to-one over great distances. And then eventually you had broadcast, which was one-to-many over great distances. But it's only more recently when we have the possibility for many-to-many over the internet as people are connected, that I think also leads to a different way of sharing information that leads to decentralization.
It does lead to decentralization, although one can have a whole nother discussion here about whether the internet has led to decentralization or centralization in many ways, because it does allow for a corporate control, which we've never had before, a very intimate corporate control.
Right. There's billions of websites, but Facebook has billions of users, and there's no sense of how you'd ever take them on.
That's exactly. Billions and billions and billions of us communicate with each other every day, and there's about half a dozen corporations that own that process.
Most of it, yes. So what I'm interested in really making sure we hit on is the trend, because it strikes me, having worked for ILSR for the last 10 years, that I'm really here in the glory days, in the sense that you started this focus on cities in a time when cities were, if anything, becoming less popular. People were fleeing cities for many years. Budgets were difficult. I live in a time now, and I'm working in a time in which everyone wants to live in cities. Not everyone, but they're incredibly sexy. People are flocking to them. I think budgets are looking better than they have in decades. So what can you tell us about the sort of the change over this time and that sense of the city as an exciting place?
Well, that's a very good summary. Actually, in 1974, the people were still fleeing the Detroits and the Clevelands and the old industrial cities, the Pittsburghs and the like. And everybody was talking about the growth of the suburbs and the shrinking, especially of the central cities at that time. And so the Institute was promoting an idea that had relatively little currency. The environmentalists hated cities. They hated cities because they thought that they were resource consuming, that they in fact exploited the land in a poor way.
There was a sense at one time that the solution to pollution is dilution. And so cities, you concentrated all the pollution. If you just could spread it out, it wouldn't be as much of a problem.
That's exactly right. I sometimes tell a story when someone asks, so what would a good rule be? That's sort of a local self-reliance principle in the environmental movement. And I talk about the 1970 Clean Air Act. And the 1970 Clean Air Act essentially said that in order to deal with the particulate pollution that was coming out of the smokestacks in cities where people lived, you would raise the height of the smokestacks. And what that then created was a regional problem of acid rain and the like. And I thought, well, what about if instead of that, we had a law that said that the end of the smokestack had to be curved, and the end of it would come into the boardroom of the corporation. And I bet you that if we did that, that is, if we married responsibility and authority, that we would have heard about clean and zero emission manufacturing a generation ago.
We recently did a digitizing project in which we were looking back at old columns that you had written, David. And in the 80s, you wrote about 3D printing and how 3D printing could fundamentally change the economy. And it's happening now, certainly. And we're seeing this incredible new technology that really lends itself to local manufacturing on a small scale. What are some of these other technologies?
Well, there's many technologies like that. When I was writing about it in the late 1980s, it was called desktop manufacturing. But certainly 3D printing is exactly what it is. But when we look at different aspects of the economy, for example, in energy, it's obvious to people in terms of energy that that it used to be that you had very specific parts of the globe that had resources that you could use to generate energy, and you dug them out and you transported them long distances and you burned them in either large power plants or through distribution networks at your gas stations and in your cars, and you created institutions and you created a national infrastructure as a result of it. But the sunlight falls on your roof, and the wind sort of blows through your backyard. And so when we're talking about moving to renewable resources, we're also talking about resources that can be claimed, that can be harnessed at the very, very local level. I mean, even at your rooftop level. And that's been true forever, but the new technologies allow us actually to do that in an economical way and to generate electricity. Previously, in thousands of years, you generated heat and you generated mechanical power. But right now, you can generate electricity, which is, of course, the premier form of energy. So that's something that's very, very new. It's very new. In fact, in 1974, when the Institute started, literally 3 months before that, 20 miles away from our headquarters, the first factory was set up that produced solar cells for terrestrial applications. They had been used for space satellites before that, and in a year's output, it generated enough solar cells to power one house. That was 1974. And in 1999 was the first time where the amount of solar capacity that was installed connected to a grid exceeded the amount of solar capacity that was installed in remote cabins and remote outposts. So that's less than 20 years ago.
Let me ask you why that matters in the sense that certainly there's less pollution from not digging fossil fuels up, transporting them long distances and whatnot. But I mean, what we care about is the electricity. Why does the economy care where it comes from?
Well, the economy doesn't care where it comes from, absolutely. But politically, it has a dynamic that's extremely different. And, nobody, no matter whether you're a conservative or a radical, you hate your utility company. And you hate your utility company because it's a monopoly and it's remote and it's not responsive and for a whole bunch of reasons. And so when you're starting to talk about energy that can be harnessed at the local level and the rooftop level and the neighborhood level and the metropolitan level, people are extremely enthusiastic about it. That cuts across ideologies. And it's that political, I think, as well as environmental dynamic that's the most important of all.
Well, I just wanted to actually reinforce your point, but and David, as you know, I love disagreeing with you. 75% of Americans, I think, undoubtedly hate their electric company because it's mostly investor-owned companies that are not meeting their needs. But I was just in Newport, Tennessee, which has a municipal electric company, which is locally owned. And though they are a monopoly, I was talking with them about how they were viewed in the community. One of the things they told me was that their installers were often offered beer, and people would be like, "Oh, you want a drink?" Because they just had such a good reputation. So this local does matter, certainly. I just wanted to throw that out there because I would hesitate for anyone who thinks that all the utility companies are hated. We see that the municipal ones tend to be really loved.
No, that's absolutely true. They do. Well, they tend to be respected, and sometimes they tend to be admired, and
rarely loved. Maybe.
And sometimes there's a tension. But the same is true about government. Most everybody hates remote government, which means the federal government. Many people, if not most people, don't like their state governments, which are remote and controlled by people that they don't even know. But most people do like their local government. They may scream about and yell about and so forth. The snow wasn't plowed when it should have been plowed and so forth. But there's a real clear connection to your local government. And so scale does matter, both in terms of the economy and politics.
But sticking with electricity, how important is it that when you're generating locally, it just means that more of that money is staying in the community versus going, some portion of your bill is going to the company that's extracting the coal. Some portion of your bill is going to the railroad monopoly that's moving it. Some portion of your money is going to a generation facility that could be in a different state. How important is it that money stays in the community in terms of why we're concerned about it?
Well, it's very important. It's important. It's part of the sort of recycling of local resources. I mean, part of the maxim of local self-reliance is that you extract the maximum amount of value you can from your local resource base, and that includes your human resource base, it includes your natural resource base, it includes your capital. And in terms of capital, you want to recycle your money as much as you can. I don't want to overemphasize that point, however, although it's a useful point to talk to people about. But when you buy from a locally owned business, you actually have influence on that locally owned business. That business probably knows you. You certainly do know them. If you want to complain, you can complain to them directly. The owner of that business may very well live locally. If they live locally, they pay property taxes to the schools that their kids go to. So there's a lot of reasons why you want to keep your money local. And one of them is economic, but again, one of them is political in the sense that you have more say, more participation, more influence over small business than you do remote business and locally owned structures rather than remotely owned structures.
Since you mentioned both economic and political, I think it's worth noting something that I've certainly learned over the years, which is that it doesn't seem to be possible to have local and distributed political power if you do not have local and distributed economic power.
That's exactly right. I mean, we talk about authority, responsibility, and capacity, the kind of arc of local self-reliance. You can't really have the exercise of authority if you don't have a productive capacity. Now, Thomas Jefferson, by the way, who hated cities, he hated cities. He thought that when people went to cities, they became propertyless, they became mobs, and they became part of political machines and boss machines. And the reason that he supported the yeoman peasant was that the yeoman peasant, in fact, could be self-sufficient. He didn't preach self-sufficiency, but could be self-sufficient. He or she had the skills and also had land and had the productive capacity. And because they have productive capacity, they would be informed in their decision-making, collective decision-making process. That is, they would be able to participate in politics knowing how the world worked. And so needing that capacity is extremely important.
And you mentioned self-sufficiency. It's just worth noting. Are we expecting cities to be self-sufficient?
No, we're expecting cities to be self-reliant.
That goes back to the name, I think.
Yes, indeed it did. One biologist talked about self-reliance being the capacity for self-sufficiency, but not self-sufficiency itself. I think it's useful for us to use the metaphor of nation, that I think that we view cities as nations, not autarkic. Autarky is a terrible thing. Only North Korea believes in autarky, and look what that got them, right? That is, we don't believe in self-sufficiency for cities, but if they treat themselves as nations, they become self-conscious. They become self-aware. They track the flow of resources through their borders. They make decisions that try to maximize the value to the people within those borders of those resource flows. And so that's what we're talking about in terms of local self-reliance.
Now, I want to sort of take this conversation and go to a different spot, which is, I think, one of the greatest problems that we face as a nation right now is how we think of areas outside of our communities. And I would point to an article that I'll be recommending people read at the end of the show, which was by James Fallows, in which he traveled around the country and talked to people, often from areas that have been seen as being really hard hit in recent economic times, cities that are not doing as well, like Allentown, where I was born. And one of the things he found was that people generally had a sense that things were going well in their community, but that nationwide we were falling apart. in that locally they liked the immigrants that were coming in to their community because they were contributing and they were helpful. But nationwide, we had this problem with immigrants. And it didn't matter where he went in the country, he felt that people locally felt their immigrants were helpful. And to some extent, I mean, I think we're a nation of 330 million people with an incredibly flawed news media. In some sense, I kind of feel like our philosophy is one of the rare ones I can see that actually can figure out how we can all get along in some ways.
Yes, absolutely. Knowledge breeds respect, I think, and admiration. And it's absolutely true. I mean, you find the same thing is true in schools. If you ask people whether the school system is good or bad, they say it's terrible, it's awful, it's there, and it's not educating. You ask them whether their school is working, they say, yeah, my school is working just fine, thank you very much. And so and the same thing is true with local politicians versus national politicians. That is, if you know them, you may be angry at them for one reason or another, but you don't think of them immediately as corrupt or ineffective.
To some extent, I actually feel like, and you have a much broader view of this than I do. I wonder if things are so specialized now. I mean, we're so far past the point at which an intelligent person can know most things in most fields that we simply cannot have policy making at such a high level. We need to push it down where there's more local expertise, because I think when we look at the state level and the federal level, we're expecting far too much expertise from people who often don't have staff at the state level. And at the federal level, we can get into what all the problems are in a different show. But fundamentally, it seems to me that the economy has gotten much more complicated. The solutions to our problems in many ways are more complicated. And there's a sort of a lack of expertise, and that if we bring it more to the local level, we will address that. Is that a dynamic that's...
Yes, it is. It is a dynamic. I mean, you can also look at it as the costs and the benefits of a particular policy when you're talking about large scale institutions. Fall on different actors, if you will. And so the heads of corporations make a decision, let's say closing a plant, for example. But that doesn't affect them negatively. It actually affects them positively. The more that we can, in fact, decentralize, distribute, push down to the community level, both the costs and the benefits, then we can have a better decision-making process. That's why I had talked about the curved smokestack coming in through the board window. That was one where you, in fact, began to marry authority and responsibility. Those who made the decisions were those who were going to feel the impact of those decisions, and you end up with very good decisions. In that case, the decision would have been to reduce pollution in the first place, rather than to spread it around.
Right, and obviously you can only do that when the boardroom is in proximity to the factory.
That's right. Exactly. Well, that's another point. It could be in another continent, I suppose. You were talking about James Fallow's piece about immigrants, migrants, and I think that would lead one to the proposition that decisions related to deportation should be pushed down to the local level. Now, in saying that, I get it that people out there are going, ooh, wait a minute, the communities are xenophobic. They can be racist. They have a history of, in fact, pushing out people who don't look like them. And I concede that point. But also because you know these people in your community, or people down the block know these people in your community, that you will probably find a community saying, there are 10% of them who are criminals. We can put them in jail, or we can send them out of the country. But 90% of them are law-abiding citizens, are just like you and me, are striving and insecure. And what we should do is nurture them, not to make them afraid. Now, that's a decision I think that would be done at the local level, and in fact is being done at the local level. I mean, you look at Los Angeles, you look at a number of different cities that in fact have provided money for legal support of their immigrants. And when one talks about sanctuary communities, one should realize that this is not a theoretical term, sanctuary communities. This is a term that says we are going to protect our neighbors against the despotism, really, of a remote government in Washington, D.C. We are at a point now, as you indicated, a new generation is growing up that does focus on cities. And at the same time, you have a federal government that essentially is trying to preempt and destroy the authority of cities and move us back 40 or 50 years in terms of the progress that we have made. And so the fight right now is at the city level, both in defending what is good and promoting even better. And so in terms of local self-reliance, we do need to not only explain the term and promote the term, but get into the nitty-gritty of what does it mean in terms of specific policy making? What does it mean in terms of specific strategies? What can a city do?
You mentioned that cities are increasingly more competent and whatnot. And with the Trump administration pulling out of the Paris Accord relating to climate change, we're seeing increasingly talk of cities having their own foreign policy now. So where does this fit in? And I have to say that I am somewhat nervous about it as someone who does believe that the nation needs a cohesive foreign policy that's unified. But I'm curious what your thoughts are in terms of from the city point of view.
Yeah, from a city point of view, when you talk about foreign policy and the climate change issue, it has foreign implications. What a city does, it's a local policy. I mean, a city in terms of energy. In the past, cities could only get involved in the energy situation by promoting energy efficiency and energy conservation. But now they can talk about local energy production. And as they do that, they in fact say, we are going to comply with this treaty or with this negotiation. And I think that that's very useful. But the term foreign policy, and I looked up some of the recent literature in terms of people promoting it, and there are many people who are promoting city foreign policy. What they mean is that cities should try to be global in attracting capital. And I think that this is understandable, and we certainly should pursue that, but we should also be careful about what that means. If, in fact, a city foreign policy is that you make yourself as attractive as possible to the creative class, to the investment class, to the people in the rest of the world who want to buy citizenship in the United States so that they come into your community and invest in your community, then I think that that's a dangerous road. And once again, it's a road that looks outward rather than inward. Now, that doesn't mean we should be parochial. Clearly, we live in a globe, and one of the wonderful things about the internet is that, in fact, we can communicate horizontally with the rest of the world. We don't have to communicate through intermediaries. We don't have to go up to a mass media and then down through the for the people who are listening to that. So I think that we do need to look outward. But I'm concerned if foreign policy means that we should, as individual cities, make ourselves as attractive to foreign investment as the nation has tried to make itself attractive to foreign investment.
Right. I think one of the concerns that just springs into my mind, of course, is that then you're potentially displacing local investment, and you don't want to privilege foreign investment over your local investment.
Well, that's true, but I think that more importantly than that, you are giving control. I mean, when somebody invests in your community, they try, if they can, to gain control over that investment and the productive capacity that they have invested in. So I think that that's more problematic than just the fact that there will be, I don't think that foreign investment will displace local investment. I think it might distort local investment, but it also brings absentee ownership, and that in itself is a significant problem.
So let's talk about recommendations. What do you have in mind for something that a person who's listened to this show might want to read to learn a little bit more, or just something that will blow their mind?
Well, I have two things. One is a book called Mutual Aid by a man named Peter Kropotkin. And Peter Kropotkin was an anarchist in the best sense of the term, which meant that he believed that people could take the future into their own hands and localize the means of production. Mutual Aid is a fascinating book in and of itself, but what I would suggest people do is to read the chapter on medieval cities. Now, Peter Kropotkin, without going through a long discussion, was a naturalist and a botanist and a scientist of the first order, and he lived at a time where Charles Darwin had come out with his theory of evolution. And Charles Darwin's theory of evolution was translated into survival of the fittest, competition, tooth and claw. And what he found in his research about nature was that nature worked by cooperation. It didn't work through competition. And he then took that as his thesis and looked at human society as well as agricultural and animal society and posited that, in fact, it was cooperation that was the fittest, if you will. And there's a chapter in Mutual Aid about medieval cities. And people who think of the period of time, 900 to 1000 BC, AD, we think of it as the Dark Ages. It was not a dark age. It was an age where city-states arose.
People were having so much time they didn't bother to record history.
Well, people could read it. It's an easy chapter read. It's probably 25 pages, but it talks about the astonishing progress, the astonishing innovation that was done when we're talking about cities of maybe 5,000 people, 10,000 people, when they came together and mutually created codes and forms of behavior and local economies and technologies and the like. So I suggest that, number one.
Let me build on that with a book that references that book and that work and Kropotkin's work in general. And that's some more recent work that uses more recent studies to make similar points, called The Penguin and the Leviathan by Yochai Benkler, who's a brilliant professor at Harvard, who often talks about decentralization. I just recently read this book and talked about a number of different studies, and I actually think makes a very nuanced case for how we overemphasize the role of selfishness. Like, we are motivated by selfishness, but we are motivated by lots of things, and we need to appreciate that.
Mm-hmm. That's very good. The second book is one that most people might know of, especially people who are listening to this podcast, and that is the book The Economy of Cities by Jane Jacobs. And it came out in the early 1970s, maybe mid to late 1970s. And her thesis is that most innovation came from cities, that cities are the reason that we have modern civilization. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why that might be the case, but she goes through it very well in terms of providing examples and the like. And I think that both, the cities of 5,000 and 10,000 people in 900 and 1000 AD, and also in terms of the modern city and its ability to generate wealth internal to itself, those would be the two books that I would suggest.
Great. And I had suggested this James Fallows article. I believe it was a cover story on The Atlantic sometime last year, How America is Putting Itself Back Together. And then just because I'm just going to go crazy with recommendations, I did recently read a book by Catherine Kramer, who's a professor at the University of Wisconsin, called The Politics of Resentment. She did a ton of interviews across Wisconsin looking at how people get their identity and how that informs their political views and where they get, actually not so much where they get their information. I thought that was a major weakness of the book, but just how they think about a lot of these different things and how they reacted over the past 5 years as we went through these elections, basically ever since Obama took office, and then also in Wisconsin with Walker. And it was a pretty interesting read. So.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you, David, for coming back on. We look forward to having you again soon, I hope.
Thanks. I'm looking forward to it as well. Thanks for the conversation.
For further context on immigrants and cities, I encourage you to read the James Fallows essay that David and Chris mentioned. There's a link to that in the show notes. You can also find links to the books that David and Chris recommended. Mutual Aid by Peter Kropotkin is available both as a print book and as a free ebook. Links to both, as well as the other books mentioned, are in the show notes as well. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, is a link to an ILSR page called 50 Years, 50 Works, a decade-spanning archive of work throughout ILSR's history. It's a treasure trove of vintage ILSR research, much of it written by David Morris, all of it relevant to this day. We'll continue our remembrance of the life and work of David Morris in the coming weeks, but for now, that's a great place to start. Here at Building Local Power, we'd love to invite you, our listeners, into the conversation. If you have thoughts about this or other episodes, ideas for future guests, or if you just want to get in touch, send me a note at buildinglocalpower@ilsr.org. And, as always, if you like what you hear, please like, subscribe, review, and share with your friends. This episode of Building Local Power was produced by me, Danny Kane, with the help of Reggie Rucker. The original 2017 episode was produced by Lisa Gonzalez. For the episode revisiting the interview, I did the editing with help from Taya Noel, who also composed the music. Thank you so much for listening, and see you in 2 weeks.